draw pictures or whatever I need to do. Covered now. Thank you. Three seasons. We're going to wait for Christy or get going?
Let me see where she is. And where she is.
Test.
What is the phone toy? What's that toy?
This is our toss around audience mic.
That's the toss around
Because
audience.
it's
You do a mic drop and it won't break it.
Yeah, completely padded, protected. If anybody has a comment, we just toss it at them.
Okay, that is way cool. Thank you.
Not too far.
And it works?
I know. I know. Yeah, I think we'll start and Chrissy can work in.
All right. Is this our first time using this thing?
Since we bought one, we had a demo unit we tried out before.
All right. All
Is that
right.
a demo unit that we used last spring?
Yeah, we had one. This is actually.
Well, that one's actually.
Well, it's 2 o'clock.
1 o'clock.
1 o'clock.
Sorry.
You're right, it's 1 o'clock. I'm a fine arts guy, I don't do numbers. I'm Mike Indiana, the Vice President of Instruction and Student Services at Weatherford College, and I can actually tell time most of the time. I'm your moderator for today's discussion of the impact of social media on America, and our panel includes Dr. Nick Pugh, who teaches government at Weatherford College, Ms. Jenny Jones, who teaches government for Weatherford College, Julie Moeller, who is our technology trainer, Dan Curley, who is general counsel for Weatherford College. That's the lawyer, for those of you who don't speak general counsel. Mr. Darrell Castillo, who instructs in the fields of history and government, and Dr. Greg Trickett, who is a philosophy instructor here at Weatherford College. So, the questions we're going to ask today.
Eventually Christy Daly.
Eventually, Christy Daly will wander in. You'll know her when she shows up. We have a list of questions that students created for this event. We're not going to try to get through all of them. We're going to have a civil dialogue about these questions that students raised, and you may have other questions. If you have a question, or you want to make a comment, please feel free to raise your hand. I will chuck at you the microphone, and then we can get you on our recording. There's Miss Daly. Otherwise, part of my job, apparently, is to make sure that everyone gets a chance to speak today, so I may occasionally be forced to interrupt a faculty member and say, somebody else's turn. And won't that be cool for you? Somebody actually gets to tell faculty to be quiet. Now, I don't get to do that very often, so I appreciate you inviting me to do this. So now that we understand the rules, let's get underway, shall we? So I'm just going to ask these questions to you generally, and we won't target anyone specifically. If you want to just jump right in, we'd appreciate it. So the first question of the day is, what do we mean when we say social media?
Okay, I'm going to start that off. Because I actually have 2 areas of expertise that I'm going to be dominating a little bit these first 3 questions, and then I'll let everybody else go at it. Right. Not only am I a technology trainer, but in a former life, I also taught social psychology to undergraduates at TCU, so I know a lot about social attitudes and how they're formed. But the first question is, what is social media, as opposed to something else that you find on the internet? And And it's platforms or a website or an application that's specifically designed to let users put their own content in and participate in some kind of social networking. So in a nutshell, that's what social media is over, say, a plain Jane website. Users can form their own groups and explore from there.
Yeah, please.
All right. With the, if you look at the term social media, perhaps you could strike that out and put corporate media, because of the monetization of the process. Most of it's driven by how can we turn this into money, how can we turn it into profit, not necessarily provide a medium for the exchange of ideas on a social level. So I think the definition is flawed.
I'd agree with that. I think that that just on the face of it, it could be much broader than just limiting it to certain platforms, although the term becomes a specialized term when we have Facebook and Twitter and other things like that come on the scene. But I mean, how many of you use, for example, texting as a kind of form of social media where you're creating your own group in a text group of your friends or certain professionals, and you're constantly kind of texting a conversation back and forth to each other. I imagine a lot of us do that. I do that. And it feels a lot like social media when I do that, but it doesn't quite fit the parameters of a platform that's being monetized or something along those lines. But for the sake of discussion, I think it's helpful to limit it to what we generally understand as social media, like Facebook and that kind of thing.
So that leads us to the next question. Are there limits to the scope of and reach of social media? If there are, what do we perceive them to be?
May I? Constitutionally, there shouldn't be. Just on the face of it, that might be a violation of the First Amendment to the Constitution, which guarantees, among other things, freedom of speech.
I only see the limitations on social media to be of one of technology and outreach. As more and more individuals have access to the web and to technology, then social media will spread, and the impact of social media will be felt not only in our democracy as we would interpret it, but also in the interrelationship between competing interests in foreign countries.
I would agree, provided though that the platform is accepted by the users. So, you know, it strikes me that the scope of social media is limited by whether or not we as users decide to use that platform. And some platforms have suffered. In fact, there was, for a significant amount of time, question about whether or not Twitter was even going to survive. It's surviving for obvious reasons now, but the scope is probably somewhat limited to what we as users will accept as a platform.
Isn't it also limited by the platform provider itself, right? I mean,
Put the parameters in.
right, yeah, I mean, I understand we want to be careful about freedom of speech, but I question whether or not we can accurately consider this a public forum, like standing in a public space in downtown and voicing my views, or coming to a publicly funded area and voicing my views. That's not what this is. This is privately funded through commercials and advertising and all that kind of stuff. And it seems like Facebook has a right to limit the content that's on there. I mean, even if I don't like it, I don't use their platform. I do something else, right?
Such as along the lines where you have a character like Alex Jones that reached a point that multiple platforms banned him for doing things that were against their stated regulations.
Right.
So,
The end user agreement.
end user, ULIS, we all like.
I would be more concerned about the limits that already exist in the laws, like no slander, no inciting people to riot, no calls for somebody to be murdered or assassinated, or no supporting of violence against others.
Right.
There was a question out there.
You're supposed to throw it at them.
Okay, so with that being stated, these companies are, in a way, they're unelected bodies that are now in control of some people's monetary lifestyle that helped build the company in a way. Some of these YouTubers especially is one of the big platforms that's demonetizing people and banning people. And they're doing so based on very loose, subjective terms of service, and things like anything political, if they don't like it, or if it's considered, what was the word, if it's considered controversial, they can just ban it and demonetize it, and anything can be considered controversial to anyone because it doesn't really have a very well-defined thing whenever they just put a broad stroke over it like that.
I'm inclined, though, to agree with Greg on this, that the problem here is it's not a traditional public forum. These are private corporations. At the end of the day, you know, feel-good commercials and ideas of companies doing good for the globe are nice, but corporations exist for one reason and one reason only, and that's to make profit for their shareholders. Period. Full stop. We're done. And so if we have a very unusual situation here with a hybrid public forum in that YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, all of these things are very, very public, but that actual platform is not owned by the public. It's owned by the shareholders and the corporations.
But because we live in a capitalist country, one of the things that we can do is we can vote with our pocketbooks.
Ding.
Right? So we go to the stations we like or that we agree with. We use the platforms that are the most beneficial to us, and there's other options, right? So if you don't like Alex Jones, and maybe some of you don't, then you know you've got your other options, and that's how you make yourself heard, is you tune into their show instead.
I think the point that you make, Chris, I think what it does is it highlights a good reason why we should be skeptical of social media as a proper platform for free speech, right? I don't know that we can think of it in those terms necessarily, because you're right. You've got money that's invading on that speech all the time. So yeah, I mean, I think there's a disconnect that the public has with what something like Facebook actually is and how they perceive it. And of course, we saw that kind of clarification, or Zuckerberg trying to clarify that before the Senate earlier in the year. The big question was, are you a content provider or are you a publisher? Which are you? And he had a hard time, if I remember right, figuring that out. How he answers that question is really important for this issue.
I think the next issue that we may have to face is whether or not the ubiquity of the social media and the dependence we have on it would lead us to treat it like a utility and say that it is a public interest, so it should be mediated in some way so that we don't have a total disintermediation of information, because it turns it into sort of a jungle of information. So the utility concept, I think, is something that will be dealt with soon.
So our next question, is it possible that social media is disrupting the concept of one person, one vote?
This is something I have a fair amount to say on for both of those hats firmly in place about how attitudes are formed and where technology can become nefarious. Which is, first of all, how our core beliefs are formed, our attitudes, and how they get adjusted. Of course, we first look to our peer groups and then out from there. And when you've got platforms where you get to pick and choose where your information is coming from, who you friend, who you follow, all those types of things, then you're creating yourself your own information bubble, right, to live inside of. So you're like, well, okay, well, you know, that's not a big problem, Julie, but what if you have a situation where another foreign entity would like to weaponize information? And that's where it gets a little bit tricky. So we know, looking back, there's been several studies now that the Russians took Cambridge Analytica information, which was culled from Facebook, correct? And it's not talked about too much, but when they raided the DNC, they were able to get their political analytics. So taking those analytics, their campaign analytics and Cambridge Analytica, you married the two, they were able to micro-target specific folders in Michigan with anti-Clinton ads, okay? We also know that the Russians actors posted almost 80,000 different posts that reached 126 million US voters, and you know, in that time period, what we saw was that we had a Russian influence on our election that no one was really aware of at the time. And the problem with that, when you've got your information bubble going and things that you've got your core beliefs inside that bubble, when you see that information that enrages you or engages you and keeps you, here's the monetized part, because Facebook was all about this, is, okay, keeps you on the page, keeps you looking at the ads, keeps you engaged in that environment. It's now, are we really in the same situation? Do we still have the same environment that we had before going into this, where what we're seeing is that 2/3 of Americans are getting some of their news from the social media, and that's undermining the social conditions that have historically made a democratic nation possible, where you have a sense of a commonwealth. Without that sense of a commonwealth, and you've got all this information coming into your little bubble and you can't see outside of it, or you're not willing to go outside of it to get the information, which was always our choice, then without that common area for us to be in, how can the state of politics turns against, well, is this, what should we not or not do, or what laws we should or shouldn't have? And now it becomes a battle between different truths, alternative truths, right? This truth, this insular group has a set of truths, and this insular group has a set of truths. There's no common place for them to have a political discussion, no common area, because everybody's stuck inside their little bubbles. And when you've got a foreign country that's taking advantage of it, Facebook basically gave them the highways, the keys of the car, the whole 9 yards. And I'm not saying that that's wrong or right, but it is definitely affecting the way our democracy is being affected. It is affecting our democracy in that level of creating these bubbles where we can have that insulation and tribalism form more solidly inside these social media groups.
Okay, are there other thoughts or responses to that?
Do we know that that actually had an impact, though, on swaying somebody who maybe wouldn't have voted another way, given the structure of Facebook to show you like-minded things? So wouldn't it have already been encouraging people who were likely to vote one way to see information that just, you know, maybe strengthened it a little bit, but not
Right, they
changed their position?
micro-targeted those on the bubble. And when you're on the bubble and you're looking and you see your friend Bob likes this one thing, and because Bob posted this, let's call it a piece of fake news. I'm like, oh, well, Bob, okay, well, I like Bob, I trust Bob, and then you start buying into what Bob thinks. So and this is an attitude formation, when you're forming that attitude and you're kind of like, you're looking for information to confirm that, if you start building yourself into that bubble, you're going to more likely then.
Maybe Bob's friends should do some reading.
Right.
I mean,
Right.
at the end of the day, you can have error and no harm,
Right.
right? So it may have been error for Facebook to have not anticipated what was going on with the London group,
Yeah.
whatever, analytic,
Cambridge
Cambridge
Analytica.
Analytica, or the Russians, but there's a lot of credence to what Jenny's saying, which is, okay, so they were micro-targeting. Did that switch anybody's opinion? And my biggest complaint with all of the whole questions about social media and what it does to influencing people and the way they vote is, well, pick up a book. Go find another source. If you didn't find another source and you've posted something that's factually incorrect, that's on you. And like, we can't fix that if you're not going to participate. This is why I say to my students, you got to know. You've got to get as much information as possible, because yeah, there are people out there that are nefarious, but some of it is not even just a bad actor looking to alter it, it's just a bad actor.
Right.
That's
And
right.
it seems to me that, and I agree with the thrust of what you're saying, Julie, here, but it seems to me that the one person, one vote, whether this disrupts that or not, we might say, well, it creates a larger, maybe it exploits what's already been disrupted, right? And so it seems like the one person, one vote idea, it's already disrupted by the kinds of things you're talking about anyway. It's not like friends of Bob aren't influenced by Bob, that they weren't influenced before social media, right? I mean, if they're hanging around Bob and they respect Bob and Bob says, vote this way, then, you know, we all have these groups that we like to get in and we're influenced by our friends and we tend to vote the way our core social groups vote, right? So that's disrupting the one person, one vote concept already. It just seems like this exploited that a little bit and maybe exploded it a little bit.
Well, I think it exploited our human nature. We all have internal press secretaries, right? When we're challenged with something, our first response is to say, no, 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 I'm right, and here's why. And that adds to the confirmation bias, right? Where I'm gonna get on Google and I'm gonna find the thing that's gonna show you you're wrong. Even though you could get on Google and find the exact opposite, because it's all out there, right? But we wanna be edified. We constantly wanna be edified. So it's tough to eliminate that sort of part of us, I think.
One of the biggest.
Okay, we're
things
going to
that
jump in
happens-
with a student question.
Oh.
But while we do,
Yeah.
That's why he's the ref.
this is a microphone, and if you do this to it, Larry's ears hurt.
So my question is that I know that social media can be disruptive to one person, one vote, like on a international level, but on a national level, let's say actual news media outlets, they narrowcast their demographics, their beliefs, and they can either inflate or even downgrade the information that they're given, and they flow to their viewers. And my question is that should we be questioning actual news media as well as social media? Because more people watch the news and trust it more than they would an actual social media forum. But wouldn't
You
that
should
manipulate-
question everything.
Local,
Yeah.
national, print.
There have been a number of cases, NBC, Ryan Williams admitted to falsifying a story about an Iraq expedition. And even just this week, the Weather Channel reporter trying to make the hurricane look worse in that spot than it was. Yeah.
Which brings up a good question for you. The whole argument here seems to be that you can be micromanaged by Russians using Cambridge Analytics to make choices in an election. How many of you have friends that you have online and they post stuff and you go, well, you're an idiot, but I'm not going to unfriend you? Do you agree with the folks that write junk online? Or are you editing? As you say, are you serving as your own press secretaries already? Are you deciding how close friends are actually to you? Yeah, let's.
Please don't throw it, I can't, I have bad vision.
Oh, that's great.
So I can't tell you have bad vision, we'll be together.
No, my quick question for however maybe unintelligent it may sound, but even with the Russians making their attack on specified people, it all comes down to whether the Russians did it, if Joe, Gene, Bob over here does it and pays for it. It's targeted advertising. It's simple as any Republican or Democrat can target these certain people, whether the different country does it or not. It doesn't make it illegal. It makes it a good tactic. And though I don't support it, it just seems like it affects it just like any other advertising would.
The difference between that kind of advertising, as we saw through Facebook, and the advertising, when I say you catch a commercial, if anybody watches commercials anymore with TiVo, is that it can appear, again, coming from your peer group, that you have, and this was what I started to say a moment ago, a lot of unfriending that happened in 2016 and 2017 of people you thought, well, oh my God, you what? And so so our groups got even more bubbled because, if you put something really wacky out there, I might put up for a little while, but about the third or fourth post, I'm like, you know what? All right, so but then as my group started to form, if advertising was coming through or being repeated, because again, it's reposting, and now it's coming from Bob, and like, oh, then that's a different kind of social influence than just a random print ad or something you caught on the TV.
There's a thought up here.
I have a rather short question. It's about how can we stop or regulate companies like Facebook and Twitter from, most of them aren't directly, communicating to Russia. They're just using their platform because they're internationally used by a lot of countries. So how can we stop them from, using their platform?
Short answer is you can't.
We can, exactly.
We just have to become more savvy
We have to be
as
vigilant.
consumers, yeah.
And the other thing I would say in connection with that, Clancy, is that, like, I don't think, I'm uncomfortable with the idea that you would unfriend somebody who was spreading this information if it was false, legitimate. But if it's a philosophical difference, whatever, have it out. But part of the problem with social media is a sense of anonymity, even if they have your name. We all know this is true. People will say stuff on Facebook or whatever that they would flat never say to somebody to their face, ever. It's the distance of computer to computer or whatever it is. But by the same token, when I'm uncomfortable with the idea that when we're confronted with a factual error that needs to be corrected or a philosophical idea that we don't agree with, our inclination will be, click, I remove you from the circle of people instead of engaging. The point of the platform is to engage, and so if we don't have respectful and honest debates, if this is where it's going to happen, this is the new public forum, then we need to be able to say, that's not objectively correct if it's not, or I disagree with you and here's why.
Yeah.
But the problem with social media, and Greg, I'm confident you may agree, is that we end up falling into common logical fallacy traps and ad hominem attacks. We make it about the message deliverer, or we make, well, if X did it, so did Y. So X, whether X did it or not is immaterial now because we think Y did it as well. So we've stopped this kind of normal debate and discussion that we have because of the anonymity of the internet. We don't care.
Well, the other issue is that this has been hinted at earlier, is that the big problem I see with social media in this whole process is not so much that it limits free speech or that it steps on us, because I'm free to say whatever I want to, and Facebook is free to block me for saying it if they want to, and that's fine. My free speech hasn't been, just my reach of speech has been affected maybe. But the big problem is that social media seems particularly geared towards helping us create echo chambers in a way that we've never been able to before. To your point of the unfriending business, right? If you're having a conversation in a room full of people at a party, you always do have the option of walking away from that person, but most people don't. If I'm engaged with someone and I don't like what you're saying, I'm going to at least try to end the conversation. I'm probably not going to walk away from you mid-sentence, But that's kind of the equivalent of what we do on social media.
It seems punitive in a way.
Right.
Like I've unfriended you.
Yeah, right. So.
Well,
You can't hang up again.
That's an interesting question to ask about the maturity of social media. But our next question on the list is, should voters take the president's assertion that his Twitter account, his policy is fact? And if they should, why should they or why should they not?
Okay.
Go ahead.
I would say no. If you've been watching his Twitter and if you've been paying attention to his policy, you know that his policy is more measured than his tweets are. His policy that actually gotten put in place is more like that of a Paul Ryan.
But that's not because of him, that's because of the people around him.
That's because it turns
I-
out there may be a second presidency.
Right, part of the beauty of the checks and balances.
Right.
It seems to me that when we have a president who deals in superlatives, like all the time, that's like his mode of speech.
Best ever.
Best ever, the most fabulous
Best ever
whatever.
hurricane.
It seems like the word "this is a policy" is just another superlative for him. So I don't know that it's a social media issue. It seems like a speech act distinction. He's not understanding how to use that word properly, and so he doesn't. So
Yeah, but that's a him thing. The next president might treat it differently.
Right, absolutely. But with him, this president, when he says, this is policy, then I say the prudent thing is to wait and see if it's policy. Because, I mean, if he gets on there and he talks about how much he loves chocolate ice cream, that's not policy. I mean, so where do we draw these lines? And the answer is that we don't draw the lines. We just assume that if it's going to be policy, we'll hear about it through the proper channels.
But we're also going to find out through the courts, possibly, if his tweets should be taken as, something he should be held accountable for.
Right.
Because I think he intends them, when he sends them out, to be taken at face value. Although I think we've all come to learn that, like you said, it's all hyperbole, but it's not all hyperbole, but a lot of it is. But some of it I think he intends for us to take very seriously.
Prior to the op-ed that came out 2 weeks ago, I probably would have leaned on ignore his, or worry about his tweets. But after the op-ed suggests that there are people there that are basically directing him away from the results of his inclinations, a second presidency, now I don't know. I don't know if the tweets mean anything, because he may say X, Y, or, I've had students, I don't know which class it was in, who said, he may have said that at the beginning of class, Dr. Nick, but now 45 minutes later he said something that's totally different. I don't know if there's somebody else that's directing that. At this point, I think his tweets are moot.
I'll sort of agree with that.
You don't sort of agree with that?
Well, that's a weird way to put it. I agree that they're moot as far as policy, but they're not as far as influence. I think they're 100% to, he has his narrative that he's constantly putting out there, and whether we agree or disagree, it's a false narrative, or that I always feel like he is talking to his base. Every single tweet, I assume he's talking to his base and not me. And so the only issue with that, and that is all, is he does rely a certain amount on that support. So should some of these other policies become real, he has support for it based on that narrative he's put out. That's all I have to say about it.
Yeah, that's speaks to the intentions. Yeah,
Right.
yeah, that's probably true.
Daryl, can we separate his policy and his personality? Last semester you said no.
I still say no.
Okay.
From
I just
my-
checking.
From my experience in the White House, no. The president can have many advisors. I was one of them, but certainly not one of the higher advisors. But there's going to be constant input, but the final say-so belongs to the President of the United States, come hell or high water.
But the question is the tweet the final say-so, or is it just fluff?
With President Trump, I don't think it is fluff. I think the man truly is.
Do you think sometimes you wish it was fluff?
Yeah, some people would wish it was fluff. But me? I'm not part of that administration, so.
Yeah, fair enough. That's fair enough.
Okay, we've got a comment up here in the back of the room.
I have a question. How do we all feel about this whole new Trump is going to get to text me with the national emergency system?
Very good question.
I hope that there are serious parameters on that one.
Yeah, how do you opt out?
I don't want to opt out.
I'm just, that's a practical question.
Yeah.
For some people it still costs them money to receive a text.
I imagine you'd have to enroll yourself on the list. I don't think that you could access. I
Well,
mean,
the
maybe I'm wrong.
national, that's like whenever, like, say someone's missing, when there's a flood coming in, it's those emergency texts that you get no matter what.
I just don't need it to come from him.
Yeah, there's-
Or any president. Like, why is that what is there nothing else for him to do right now?
It's the
Send
most,
out an Amber Alert?
it's the most egregious thing that's happened since YouTube forced that album on us through iTunes. I mean,
Yes.
I thought that same thought.
Well, with us allowing the government like we have to allow anti-free speech with the classification of everything, it's likely that they'll know something way before any news media or anything does, and if it has to be out immediately, they're the only ones that may know. And they may need to get it out that quickly if there is like a imminent threat of war or something coming towards our country.
Do you think that's how Trump would use it, though?
Not Trump.
No, I'm serious, I don't know, I honestly don't. If that were the case and it were only for, really serious emergencies, I would want to be on the list. If, on the other hand, it's used as a tool to, try and impact or influence me, I would not want to be on the list. So I
Like
think
an
it's
election.
There's a comment from the House out here with the microphone.
Sorry. No, it's basically just like the Amber Alerts. It's not gonna cost anybody anything. It's on a different section that you're paying on taxes already on your phone. And it's for the entire country to know that, hey, there's a flood about to hit your house and you weren't paying attention to the news or your neighbor.
Great,
So
why
those
isn't it
people-
coming from FEMA? Why does it
Yeah.
have to come from his office? That's
There's
the
no
only
budget
part of
allowed
this,
for
and-
government. They
and
have
just
money enough to-
suspicious of any politician who finds a new place to insert themselves.
I don't think it's just him. I think it's the White House itself, because I'm pretty sure this is gonna carry on outside of him. It
Well, if
doesn't
it's
sound
the
like
White
it's
House,
just for
then
him. It's actually opening up a new way to, because a lot of people are complaining about how they didn't know what was happening and they got stuck in floods and they didn't think it was even gonna hit their neighborhood, they didn't get the notification, so there's another way to reach them.
I would ask,
I don't
are
think
we
there's
not
any negative.
responsible for part of this?
Thank you.
We're the ones who have given the president more say, more voice. This started with FDR and his fireside chats coming into your living room. It used to be that you didn't hear from the president very much at all. People looked to their congressmen and to their state governments rather than the federal government and the presidency to be their savior.
Student comment up here, or
Well,
question?
and the more approachable president, right? So
Yes.
starting with Clinton and
Yeah.
going on the late night shows, and Obama going on the late night shows. Bush didn't have to do it, but
He'd
those
have been
two
good at
places. Yeah. Sorry.
On the whole Amber Alert thing coming from the president, we already had an incident with that. The Hawaii thing with the ballistic missile.
Right.
We already had an incident with that, and that wasn't even Trump himself.
Oh.
Who's to say?
Does
we
anybody
wouldn't-
know what she's talking about? Everybody know that it was I think that
False
person.
alarm.
It was a false alarm.
It was, but I think that person actually worked for the military that sent that out. Or it
Yeah, but I
got
think what
tied
you're
in with
suggesting
a
is
line.
people can make mistakes
Yeah,
with
they
it,
can
right?
make mistakes like that and cause a panic like that did.
We don't want a war of the worlds,
Right.
moment.
I don't
right?
mean to laugh, but I wonder how that guy's day went.
Yeah.
I really do. I wonder if it was like,
Orson Welles.
uh-oh.
No, he's in outer Mongolia right
Oops.
now.
Yeah, right. No, they just left him in Hawaii. Right.
In a bunker.
In a bunker.
Yeah, in a bunker. You can't even
That's
do
a
it.
great
Can't go to the
question.
beach, right?
Okay, our next question is, how does the New York Times op-ed alter the discussion about the administration's use of social media? Dr. Pugh had hit on this a bit.
Yeah, I think we've kind of hit on this a little bit. I think that the broader question that I have associated with that is, what does the op-ed mean for us in terms of trust in government? That is, if we accept what is asserted in the op-ed as true, that there are members of the Trump administration actively thwarting some of his less brilliant ideas, ostensibly running a second presidency, what does that do to the nature of the voting public's trust in government? And to find out that it's destroyed is rational. But I don't know that that's true for everybody. And if we are taking as true the op-ed, that is, we're operating under the assumption that this is really going on, then probably the only place that he's not getting any influence is on his Twitter account. Because it's personal to him. It's on his phone. And they can't take his phone off his desk.
But it does speak to the question of the media, and somebody else mentions, we have legitimate outlets like the New York Times and CNN and Fox News, et cetera, and then we have blogs and we have all sorts of other avenues. But if you're gonna look at journalistic integrity, right, then the New York Times is perhaps one of the most awarded of, probably of all time. And I'm not suggesting there's not some conflict there, but I think we probably should assume that whoever wrote it sincerely. And I think that we would be foolish to just ignore it as partisan, BS. I don't think that's what we should do.
Well, first of all, that person should be fired when they're found out.
They will be.
They will be.
That's why they didn't want to put the name on there.
Well, and that's a cowardly way of approaching the dissemination of information. But the other thing too is that article made it sound like it was extraordinary for there to be infighting in the White House. That is standard, okay? And when I was there, it's the Bushies versus the Reaganites, okay? We were bushwhacked, okay? I mean, that is standard. There's always going to be advisors fighting advisors.
Yeah, but there was nobody in that administration, and you tell me if I'm wrong, who was suggesting the 25th Amendment be invoked. That's quite a leap, don't you think?
But it was invoked. Reagan invoked the 25th Amendment.
Well,
Yeah, because he
okay,
got
but
shot.
come on, I mean, not to do
Because he was on him.
Yeah, you know, so it was invoked.
Okay, there's a comment from out here, and then we'll move on to the next question. Because we seem to have covered. Go ahead.
It's just like on social media. If I write something that is catchy enough, somebody's going to share it, somebody's going to share it, somebody's going to share it. With writing op-eds and things like that to a newspaper, it doesn't matter. If you have somebody so much from another administration send there, I'm not saying they are or they aren't. I'm not saying it's factual or unfactual. But if they go with a juicy enough article, and I have personal experience with this, to a newspaper and say, hey, look at this, read this, it fits your narrative. This is great, it's going to influence people. They're going to print it. They're going to print it regardless without fact checking. They cannot fact check an opinion. They cannot fact check an opinion. They cannot fact check a lie. Not something like that they don't have a reach into. So whether it's factual or not, it's just something written by somebody put in the paper. We don't know the factual basis of it. We're not there.
But there are factual assertions in the op-ed. There are factual assertions about actions or inactions that are being taken by the administration. And more to the point, we still, at the end of the day, we do have to look at the New York Times. I'm telling you now, their op-ed editor did not approve the publication of that op-ed. That was done almost certainly by the publisher themselves, because that op-ed has the potential for creating an actual a question of constitutional crisis. That is, the president may not be running the country.
The president never is running the country, though. I mean, where they have an actual decision, they have a group of people around them to influence, no matter what president it is. With those influences, you can say, hey, just with Obama, I like Obama. I like them all. I'm not trying to push any particular president. I'm just saying, but he had a group of people around him, advisors. Those advisors are like, hey, the president says, I have a great idea. I'm going to do this. The advisor said, hey, that's illegal and a horrible idea. You're not going to do that. The president steps out and doesn't do that. That makes the president not fully in control. That makes the president influenced by
but he
everybody.
can make the decision to heed his advice. And what the New York Times op-ed writer said was that they were basically tricking him. They weren't trying to influence him. They were trying to.
It's not a discussion.
That's politics, right there. Tricking. You don't like it? I'm going to get them on my side. I'm going to get them on my side. That's just politics.
Okay, well, today's discussion is about social media and not about specifically the New York op-ed piece, but what a wonderful example of media coming into play in government. You have a thought?
Yes, assuming that people in the masses are stupid. And that,
That's a fair assumption.
People are going to believe what they want to believe. I have heard people on either side wholeheartedly believing the op-ed, and then people on the other side saying, well, you know, somebody didn't own up to it, it's obviously false. So do you think, with that in mind, that it would be wise for the Trump administration to completely ignore it and act like it didn't happen and not expose the person who wrote it?
Well, in the social media context, he should probably have not immediately treated treason.
Treason.
Because that's not treason. It's probably a fireable offense. It's not treason.
It's disloyalty.
It's disloyalty at best. Yeah.
But I think the interesting thing about this whole thing, when we bring it back to social media, is how many of you heard about the op-ed piece or read it on social media? I didn't. Yeah. So, I mean, if anything, the question has to do with, should this, what was it? Should it alter the discussion about the administration's use of social media? I think that as in bed as he is with social media, it makes his claims of fake news a little harder to make, right? If he's on social media giving it all the time, then it does seem a little more arbitrary for him to be like, well, that's fake news, that's fake news, that's fake
Yeah.
news. Because he can't with one big broad brush say this is all fake news.
Aren't his claims of fake news more directed at the mainstream media, not at social media?
Well, I think you're right, but it does. Yeah, I think you're right.
That is our next question, right?
Oh, no, I'm gonna jump around a little bit.
The citizens accepted industry creative policy response to concerns that social
Apparently I'm
media
not
promotes
moderating,
fake news.
apparently.
I was like, no, obviously, is that the next one?
No, it isn't necessarily. I think we spent a lot of time on the New York Times op-ed. We probably want to talk about social media and its influence. So, because you gave me the keys, Nick.
I'm fine.
You can all regret it later.
I'm enjoying the ride. You drive as hard and as fast as you want to go.
Do social media companies owe a duty to the users to fact-check political content for factual correctness or truthfulness? Do social media?
I think it depends on the source. I think if it's the Huffington Post, yes. I think they should. I think if it's Christie's daily blog, no. I think it depends on if you're looking, and by the way, there's a great site called Media Bias, and you can go there and you can look at dozens and dozens of media outlets, which include, Alex Jones and CNN and Fox and, individuals and blogs and just a very wide gamut. And it'll tell you, does it go left, does it go right, how accurate, what does PolitiFact say about it, et cetera, et cetera. But the problem is, has anyone even ever heard of it? Has anyone checked that?
Nobody cares.
Well, that's okay. So some of us do, but I think a lot of us don't.
Right.
And if we did more, then that would be a very, very relevant issue. What do you guys think?
Doesn't this go back to whether or not they're a publisher or a content provider?
It
Right. I mean,
could.
if they're a publisher, then they have due diligence that they have to. Well, I mean, I guess that's not entirely true. If they're a publisher, they can say, well, we vetted that this person wanted to do this and say it. I don't know that every publisher is wedded to the ideas that they publish, but it seems to me that we're even going beyond publisher or content provider to a news media group, right? If we're thinking of them as some arm of the news media group, then yeah, it seems like they do have a journalistic obligation to do that.
And those
But I
sources-
can guarantee you that they don't think of themselves, depending on what's going on and what particular day and what they had for lunch, they're not gonna identify as any one of those things.
But the sources that have the most, what's the word? I'm looking for?
Credibility?
Thank you, credibility, are the ones that have got, lots of peer review and lots of other folks weighing in. And when you go to PolitiFact or one of the other sources, you see that they're telling the truth, 90% of the time or 95 or something. But you can always find false narratives in any, branch of the media. You just have to get your own, use good judgment when you pick a source.
So we're running out of time, so I'm going to jump around a little bit here. Is there other thoughts on
There was a question.
where at?
Right there. Didn't you have a question?
Yes, I did. Okay. What was that?
Microphone. Hold on.
Were we still?
Don't.
If
Uh-oh,
I
sorry,
had
your
a
ears.
football from that, we'd be so. Go ahead.
Okay, so as far as the social media stuff goes like that, and the third party, or you have all your different media sources. You have what's considered like your official media, I would guess, like CNN, Fox, MSNBC, your New York Times, and then you also have official news sites on things like YouTube and Facebook, and people who have actually made the corporation a lot of money. In some cases, I don't know the numbers for sure, but I would wager that possibly more than some of those shareholders have put into the company themselves, and on the low end. And these, like Google owns YouTube, and then there's also Facebook. These guys have basically a monopoly of this universal area where people go to put their content out there for these news ideas and things like that. They have a monopoly on it because anytime someone else tries to come up with a thing, they'll railroad someone by either buying them out or they'll have someone try and shut them down, as they have with the FCC. They've had several other websites that people have tried starting up. I've seen in all sorts of different chat forums online that people will have shut down. Like they'll have pictures of their whole website, and then they'll have it where it's been shut down by people keeping them out of the loop so that they don't have a third party to go to. And then YouTube takes control of these, and then they want to demonetize people that have a legitimate voice. And one of the things you were saying is that people get stuck in these echo chambers. With the echo chambers is that's something people are going to do no matter what. If they're talking to people in real life, if they're just picking up a newspaper they like, a lot of people are going to go with confirmation bias in what they like. It doesn't matter what source they are. It's why I try to pay attention to as many as I can. And if you do pay attention, CNN and Fox oftentimes support opposite agendas where they'll try to inflame people to hate each other for no particular reason other than the fact that they're a Republican or a Democrat.
Are you wondering what we can do about that?
Oh, I know one thing we can do about it. We can stop, in general, stop being idiots and actually listen to what other people have to say. One of the things that they do is they'll, some of the people that have been demonetized have been like Steven Crowder, Secular Talk, Kyle Kalinske. These are people from two opposite ends of the political spectrum, and they have other people come on their shows that they disagree with and talk to, and they actually try to talk out their problems, and then they'll get demonetized for controversial content.
So that I make sure I'm understanding, your general concern sounds to me like you're worried that Google and other entities like Google are cutting people out.
They are.
Okay, that's fine. I understand. I want to make sure I wrap my head. So my question back to you then would be, is Google or are Google, YouTube, Facebook, are these public forums?
Well, whenever they have enough money to influence the votes and things of that nature, as they do oftentimes with these large corporations, it basically becomes a form of communism where you do not elect this body. And they then have financial and political control over how you do, because they want to silence their political opponents, whether it be, and a lot of times it's just over the principle of these people want to have free speech dialogue between each other.
Well, they do. See, that's the thing, is that if Google and YouTube, etc., are simply corporations providing a service, they may or may not be subject to the First Amendment, and probably not. They're not. It says Congress shall make no law, not YouTube.
Well, they're subject to the First
Well,
Amendment.
then
They can do their own policies.
That's
They
right.
can create any kind of, and it's going to be based on how much money they're going to make.
Well, and then at the end of the First Amendment, it does say that, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. This would be a redress of grievances because at this point they have become as powerful in some cases to where they can influence our Congress, where they can influence these things, to where I think if they are trying to cut out the free speech part of it, the other ideas, that shouldn't be allowed to silence people or to take away people's.
But it's not a grievance of the government. It's a grievance of a company. So yeah, I have the right to address my grievances to the government, and they can't prohibit me from doing that. They can't prohibit me from voicing my grievances towards other companies. If you want to voice grievances against Google, go ahead and do it. Nobody's stopping you. But the point I think that they're making here is that this is not a government entity. Google is, right? They're a corporation, they're a company. So it's a private domain in that regard. Even if they're publicly traded, it's still a private domain. So if they don't want somebody to say something, then it's their prerogative.
I think
right?
the question is, when they control all of the avenues of social communication, digital communication that are available, do they become a shadow government? Do they become a controlling entity that the people should then sue Google about? That's what you're really asking.
No more than
Who's saying
us,
that?
or anyone else as a result of Citizens United.
Well, it's called capitalism, and it makes things very complicated.
Well, Exxon isn't a speech-based company.
No, but they are now
their
because of
speech is a lot
Citizens
louder than
United.
your
It's
speech.
way louder than yours.
Oh, it is, yes, I agree, I understand that, but
You don't have the microphone anymore.
I'm sorry.
This has to be one of your students.
It's one of my students.
I love it.
I'm here for fun, actually.
Did we get to the last question?
We're like out of time. We're at 1:56, and there's some things I have to do before we finish up. So those of you who want to, stay and keep chatting with these people. They're faculty. They'll talk till your ears fall off.
Yeah,
But
if you're at my 2 o'clock, don't rush off.
could you please, they said, announce that we have voter registration for new voters available. Voters who would like updates on their voter registration, change of address with county change of name. We can also answer questions about voter registration for the midterms elections on November 9th, early voting October 22nd to November 2nd. And the voter registration for new voters is where?
Right there, right on that house. You want to?
Right outside the door?
We'll stay right here.
We'll stay right here. Okay, so thank you for coming and participating. Voting is your way of raising your voice in our democracy. So coming here was great, but voting's even better.
If you want
Thank you all. Thank you, panel.